whatever we want to call it, whatever the tag is on the outside, we know what's on the inside. It's hate. Prejudice. I don't want that nation to be better than me and to be blessed by you, O God. If you are possessed with prejudice and hate, you are a prisoner. You are a prisoner. And the struggle of hate today, like the Count of Monte Cristo was falsely condemned when he got out of prison, spent the rest of his life hunting down his accusers. And as somebody said, worse than being a victim of that kind of hate is being the possessor of that kind of hate. Jonah was possessed by prejudice. He was possessed by a resistant will. You know, my brother Meher was speaking this morning, and he was talking about how we struggle with the battle within ourselves, and we talk to people and we seek answers and look for an apologetic in a place where questions are not asked. And in that setting, what you're looking at is the most stubborn will of all for centuries. How do you break a will down? It is Richard Weaver, the great professor of English literature from the University of Chicago, who said this: how frequently it is brought to our attention that nothing good can be done if the will is wrong. Reason alone fails to justify itself. If the disposition is wrong, reason increases malfeasance. If it is right, reason orders and furthers the good. If the disposition is wrong, reason increases malfeasance. If it is right, reason orders and furthers the good. Prejudice, resistance, and our perishability. So Jonah is swallowed up by this massive sea creature, and he is sure he's going to die because the body is not going to be able to survive it, he sees. And so what I say to you is this: the three great struggles, the hate which is within us, the will that empowers us, and the perishability that ultimately takes us. I want you to follow me. God always has an object of His grace, and He has a means of His grace. And when the means, who is the minister, becomes both the object and the means of His grace, you've got a titanic struggle going on. God is having to deal with the means of His grace as the object of His grace and break this prejudice down within Jonah. And as He works and works away today, I look at the answer that you and I must ultimately find. The answer of why is Christ greater than Jonah? Because of one simple thing. Beyond all the obvious, God loves those who persecute His name and hate His name. All the other is true, but this one often misses us. Sometimes I've stood up in front of an audience where I'm so angry with one of the questioners, and I mutter a prayer inside me and I say, Lord, give me the love for him that you have for him. I want to read for you what Napoleon said to one of his counts. He said, can you tell me who Jesus Christ was? Count said, I have no response. Napoleon said this, well, then I will tell you. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded great empires. But upon what do these creations of our genius depend? Upon force? Yes. Jesus alone founded his empire upon love. And to this very day, millions will die for him. I think I understand something of human nature, and I tell you all these men were men. I tell you all these were men, and I'm a man. No one else is like this Jesus. He seems to me to be more than a man. I have inspired multitudes with such an enthusiastic devotion. They would have died for me. But to do this, it was necessary that I should be visibly present with the electric influence of my looks, my words, my voice. When I saw men and spoke to them, I lighted up the flame of self-devotion in their hearts. Jesus alone has succeeded in so raising the mind of a man towards the unseen that it becomes insensible to the barriers of time and space. Across a chasm of 1800 years, Jesus Christ makes a demand which is beyond all others difficult to satisfy. He asks for that which a philosopher may often seek in vain at the hands of his friends, or a father of his children, or a bride of his spouse, or a man of her spouse, or a man of his brother. Jesus asks for your heart. He will have it entirely to himself. He demands it unconditionally, and forthwith his demand seems to be granted. Wonderful. In defiance of time and space, the soul of a man with all its powers and faculties becomes an annexation to the empire of Jesus. All who sincerely believe in him experience that remarkable supernatural love towards him. This phenomenon is unaccountable to me. It is altogether beyond the scope of man's creative powers. Time, the great destroyer, is powerless to extinguish this sacred flame. Time can neither exhaust its strength nor put a limit to its range. This is it which strikes me most. I have often thought of it. This is what proves to me quite convincingly the divinity of Jesus Christ. Napoleon. Have you listened to political rhetoric lately? Seen the hate? I'm better by putting you down. You know, years ago when I left my homeland, I left it because things like this happened every day and you wondered about it. Now I see it happening every day out here. Sometimes you listen to some vitriolic stuff and some foul language coming out of our leaders in private, four-letter words, profane words, horrible words, and you say, these are the ones we've trusted the nation, the destiny of history with? Look at Christ. He has your heart because he has conquered it with his love. He is the divine conqueror. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is looking for heroes, and we can't find those. Paul Witz, the psychologist, quoting Ernest Becker, says, religionists today wonder why youth have abandoned the churches, not wanting to realize that it's precisely because organized religion openly subscribes to a commercial industrial hero system that is almost openly defunct. It so obviously denies reality and banishes sacredness with bureaucratic dedication. Men are treated as things and the world is pulled down to their size. The churches subscribe to this empty heroics of possession, display, manipulation. I think today's Christianity is in trouble, not because of its stories, not because its stories are dead, but because it does not offer its ideal of heroic sainthood as an immediate personal one to be lived by believers. In a perverse way, the churches have turned their backs upon both the miraculousness of creation and on the need to do something heroic in this world. You know what is the greatest miracle? No, it's not Jonah being preserved in the whale. The greatest miracle is that God can change a heart of hate into a heart of love. That God can change a heart of hate into a heart of love. Jonah became the object of God's grace, but God had to work in him through the means of his grace. I loved what Tanya said. As much applies to me. We need to love those that hate us, love those that persecute us. Christ is greater than Jonah. Christ is greater than any worldview because he engenders in your heart that generosity of love against which there is no law. A greater than the temple, a greater than Jonah, and it comes finally, he says, a greater than a Solomon is here. Solomon, profound in his proverbs, profound in his poetry, he brought Israel the darkest days of indebtedness and immorality because it was in his own life. He plunged the nation into debt, building till they couldn't pay. And his harem was his daily attendance and his daily fare. He knew how to tell us things with proverbial wisdom. He did not know how to live it. That's the thing. Take a look under a microscope of anyone who's claimed to prophetic status, and I'll guarantee this is what you will find out. apart from Jesus Christ. For Jesus, his word was met by his deed. You know, great poets will collapse. I remember when I was studying at Cambridge, reading the life of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great romantic poet, one of my favorites. Kubla Khan, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and so on. But he so drenched his body with drugs, especially opium, till the gift was gone, and he went and sat in front of a desk, and he couldn't write. Next day he went back, again he couldn't write, till he pounded his fist on the desk, screaming out he wanted to write a piece of poetry. It no longer came, it was gone. Like a great Mario Lanza who abused those vocal cords by a habit and a lifestyle that his vocal cords could not take, till a man could not sing with those range of notes that he once did. Like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who had tens of thousands in St. Petersburg following his cortege when he died. And Dostoevsky was a man who wanted to serve Christ, but he could never break free from his enslavement to gambling. Alexander the Great wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. But the thing is, he couldn't really conquer himself and his enslavements. Michael Jackson, what a gifted musician he was. What a gifted body he had to be able to do that which young people were just enamored by. He couldn't conquer his own inability to accept himself in the way he looked. Elvis Presley, when he lost his fame, lived like a pharmaceutical freak. And I think one of the greatest entertainers of all time he was, but he lost it. Francis Thompson, they said he was a greater than Milton, destroyed himself with drugs. So do you and I, as speakers especially, and to others I say to you, it's not enough to have it up here. It's not enough to have great words of wisdom. It's very important that it not be broken in the process of living it out. You see, ladies and gentlemen, every nation has its breaking point, and every life has its breaking point if the transcending truth of Christ does not conquer from here to here. He is the divine conqueror who's a greater than the temple, a greater than the Jonah, and a greater than Solomon. And why is that? Because he sees you as you are and takes you the way you are. And let no one deny you of the uniqueness with which God has made you. He's made you warts and all. He's made you weaknesses and all. He's made you fragility and all. And it's not your eloquence from behind a lectern or with a pen. It is the eloquence of connection from here to here. When that is connected, the power of thinking becomes the power of living. I want to close, and I want to pull this together in a very, very applicational way. And I want to say these two or three things. Please give me your undivided attention. William Wilberforce lived in the mid-1700s to mid-1759 to 1833, his date of birth, date of death. Many of us don't know he was a hunchback, like this. When he was in school, the kids used to make him curl his body up and kill themselves laughing. But Boswell said of him, when I saw him stand up at the House of Commons to speak, I saw a shrimp mount the table, but as I listened, he grew and grew until the shrimp became a whale. Because he was a master of elocution and a perfect speaker with words. But you know what happened to him? At the age of 26, he found Christ. And he sat with William Pitt, and he said to him, we have to break the scourge of slavery. We have to break it in my lifetime. And one biographer begins his biography by saying the hand that struck the shackles from the galled limbs of our British slaves was the hand of a hunchback. When he became a member of Parliament, F.W. Borum says he rose to address the House of Commons. He looked like a dwarf that had jumped out of a fairy tale. By the time he finished his speech, he looked like a giant out of the same story. He sat with William Pitt on a bench in Kent one day, and he said, we have to break this scourge. Help me. We have to break this scourge. When he died at his funeral, 1 out of every 4 in London draped their body in black because they knew a true hero had been lost. And I'll tell you, in the 18th century, when over 1 million had been transported from Africa to Jamaica, Wilberforce was watching the numbers, and they thought they'd toss him a bone and said to him, all right, no more in this century, no more, we won't transport anymore. He said, that's not enough. No, we have to stop it and free them completely. They're our fellow human beings, made in the image of God. Don't just satisfy me by saying we'll stop new transportation. Break the chains. For 50 years he fought it. He was lying on his deathbed when a messenger came to him and said, the bill is passed. He put his head back on the pillow and he said, thank you, God. Thank you, God. I have lived to see this day. Because he knew a greater than a Jonah. He knew a greater than a temple. He knew a greater than Solomon. He killed hate. He killed the power of the will. He killed that resistance and prejudice and the triumph of the Galilean. Removed the grayness of breath to a blossoming new day. 2 years ago, an atheist by the name of Matthew Paris went to Africa. His lifestyle, if you know anything about Matthew Paris, who writes in the Times, he spent his early years in Africa, now in England, a well-known writer. He comes back and he writes this article. Before Christmas, I returned after having been there for 45 years to the country I knew as a boy was Nyasaland. Today it's Malawi. And the Times Christmas appeal includes a small British charity working there called Pump Aid. And he goes on to exclaim it. He says, you know what? I've been trying to banish a belief in God all my life. But an observation I'm making now, I've been finding unable to avoid. It confounds my ideological beliefs and stubbornly refuses to fit my worldview. And as an atheist, I'm now embarrassed at my growing assertion constantly that there is no God. Yes, as an atheist, I'm coming back convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism has made in Africa, very distinct to all the other NGOs. And he goes on to talk about the transformation that the Christian message brings. And he says this, you know, when I was there, I didn't meet any missionaries. You do not encounter missionaries in the lobbies of expensive hotels discussing development strategy documents as you do with the big NGOs. But I noticed that the handful of these people I was working with this little aid team from Zimbabwe, were privately very strong Christians. I never heard any one of them speak so boldly about religion and talking to me. But when I picked them up, I saw one studying a devotional textbook in the car. And on a Sunday, another one of them going to church at dawn for a 2-hour service. It would suit me to believe that their honesty, diligence, and optimism in their work was unconnected with personal faith. No, their work was in many ways secular, but it was deeply influenced by their Christian faith. And he goes on to say this, Christianity, with its teaching of a direct personal two-way link between the individual and God, unmediated by the collective and unsubordinate to any other human being, smashes straight through the philosophical, spiritual framework with which I'm prone to think. It offers something to hold on to those anxious to cast off a crushing tribal groupthink. That is why and how it liberates those who want Africa to walk tall amid the 21st century of global competition must not kid themselves into believing that material means or even know-how that accompanies what we call development will bring about this change in Africa. No. A whole belief system has to be changed, and I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation will leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. Do you hear what he said? No, it's not just money. It's not just some new program, however good that may be. And in the middle of the article he says, I'm shocked that as an atheist, I am saying what I am saying. He said there's a redemptive component to the message of Christ that unless that heart is changed, no amount of goodwill will change society. That will take a greater than a temple, a greater than a Jonah, and a greater than a Solomon. I close with these two quotations. In a desert in Libya, some time ago, an archaeologist found this stone and dusted it off, and here's what it said. I, the captain of a legion of Rome, serving in the desert of Libya, have learned and pondered this truth in life. There are only two things to be sought, love and power, and nobody has both. There are two things to be sought, love and power, and nobody has both. I have just presented to you the one who has both, a greater than the temple, a greater than Jonah, and a greater than Solomon. The divine conqueror has the power of truth through the power of love, who conquers time with the vision of the eternal. He goes beyond religion, beyond passion, and beyond the intellect. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we are dreaming dreams and seeing great visions, because we have the greater truth, the divine conqueror. The world grows gray under the breath of oneself, but the world may thrive again under the love and the power of the divine conqueror. Mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, 'tis all isn't in vain. You throw the dust into the wind and the wind blows it back again. And so the against the notion of the existence of God. Almost every question that is raised has made an assumption that the questioner knows what the purpose and meaning of life is. How do you define evil if you don't know what the purpose of life is? It's just a variation of something. It's not evil. It's not good. How do you know that a car was not intended to be used as a weapon unless you know what a car was designed for? You know, in America now, we're discussing all these things about gun laws and all, and it's very important to discuss it. Very important to discuss it. We need to understand these things. But you know what's forgotten oftentimes? That it takes three people, three components to do a killing. It takes a person, it takes a weapon, and it takes ammunition. And we think ammunition is only in the form of a bullet. Have you ever thought of the ammunition that comes across the airways, that pours hate into a person's mind? The ammunition that dehumanizes people? The ammunition that does not know how to treat your fellow human being with respect? The ammunition of sensuality, of depravity? Even in our elections, the words that are used are so aggressive and vitriolic and sometimes hostile. One candidate running for election in America, when he was running for office, told people to go and vote. It was the best form of revenge. Wow. Is that what something so noble as a vote is all about? Revenge? Not to make righteousness grow? This is the kind of ammunition we are pouring into young minds. And some of this stuff goes on and on and on. And it is easier for us to point to an instrument rather than try to understand the depravity and the horror of the human heart. Malcolm Muggeridge put it in these words. He said two things. One is very simply stated, and the other is rather in a complex way stated, so please follow me in both of them. He said this: the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact, even at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted. Hear what he's saying? The depravity of man is the most empirically verifiable fact. It's the most obvious thing to see. But at the same time, it is the most intellectually resisted. We don't want to accept it because that takes us into theological terrain.
Good, that's right.
And the purpose of life. And then he said this in the 70s, shortly after he resigned from his chaplaincy at the University of Edinburgh in his last talk at St. Giles. He made some comments and he said, "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." Now, this comes from a man who was one time editor of Punch magazine. He said he had the most difficult job in the world of trying to make the English laugh. And then he went on to become more sober-minded himself when he realized what was happening to Western culture. In the 1970s, he made that statement. And what we are seeing now has been going on for the last several decades. I want to talk to you this afternoon in the time that I have. What is apologetics going to have to look like in this 21st century? What do I mean by apologetics? Apologetic comes from the Greek word apologia, which literally brings in two convergent strands. Number one is the defense of the Christian faith in Christian terms. You are presenting an apologia, which actually means to give an answer to. The Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2, when they are confused at the descent of the Holy Spirit, he says, "Let me explain. Let me give you an apologetic." This is that which was spoken of by the prophet Joel. When Peter is writing again after having that extraordinary experience on that Mount of Transfiguration and all, he writes, "We now have the word of prophecy more certain." And then he goes on to say, "Always be prepared to give an apologia for the hope that is within you." Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. So one strand is that of reasoning and argument, but then there is another strand in apologetics, which is to clarify truth claims. You're making something clear that seemed rather muddied or ambiguous or vague prior to that. So the task of the apologist is to give a clear presentation of the gospel and to be able to stand and to defend that gospel in the light of contrary worldviews. That's the difficult task of Christian apologetics, and we are all apologists. The only difference could be some could be doing a good job at it and some could be doing a not so good job at it. We're all called to give a reason for the hope that is within us. So let me give for you some descriptions of what has happened in Western culture, particularly in the previous century, and then bring to you a response of what I think it is going to take from the church to respond to our times. The first is this: the popularization of the death of God, the popularization of the death of God movement. What do I mean by that? In the year 1900, the most famous atheist of the previous century passed away. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the German philosopher whose father was a pastor, both of whose grandfathers were in the ministry. Nietzsche lost his faith in God. And the irony of it is that he said, when we actually find out that God has died in the 19th century, he said two things are going to happen in the 20th century. The 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history, said he, and a universal madness will break out. The 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history, and a universal madness would break out. Ironically, he took the latter step in his own life. In the last 13 years of his life, he spent insane. And his mother testified that while she sat by his side, this brilliant philosopher, many think he died of having contracted venereal disease and other complications came in, but this brilliant philosopher went into silence for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time, while his mother would sit by his bedside and suddenly would break out of that silence. And what would he say in the midst of that? Verses of scripture that he had learned as a younger boy. And was he right about the 20th century? We killed more people in the 20th century than the previous 19 put together. But he's the one who popularized the phrase, God is dead, God has died. But then he went on to use metaphors like this. Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the horizon? Is there any up or down left? Must lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? What sacred games will we need to invent to help us cope with this, the greatest of deeds that humanity has ever done? He said that. You see, he realized the ramifications of a godless existence were immense.
Yes.
No up or down, no horizon, no light by which to walk. He recognized that. And he struggled with this in his own heart, as did Charles Darwin. If nature is red in tooth and claw, that redness is going to continue if you're going to survive, because there is no God. So Nietzsche popularized the phrase, God is dead. But he struggled with the ramifications. Not so now. Now you've got people like Richard Dawkins and all triumphantly saying, at last we've been liberated from this kind of nonsense and tooth fairy belief. The irony of a man like Dawkins is that he was professor at Oxford University, a university that was founded with the motto, the Lord is my light. The Lord is my light. Now what has happened is we are willing to live with the strident ramifications of a no-God universe. That's the difference. It's not so much that we've come to the conclusion that God has died, but that we're willing now to actually believe it's okay. We clench our fist. We've been liberated. Aldous Huxley said it in the 40s, I want this world not to have meaning, because a meaningless world, he says, frees me to pursue my own political and erotic ideas and ideologies. What do I mean by this? So Dawkins came to Washington to get together a lot of atheists in a kind of a rah-rah type of a campaign. And somebody from the audience asked him, what do we do then with those who believe in God? And Dawkins said, mock them. His answer from the platform, mock them, ridicule them. Somebody wrote to me and asked me, what do I think of that suggestion? I said, I think it's a great idea, and I think Dawkins should go and start that in Saudi Arabia. There's bad news that'll follow, but the good news is he'll only need a one-way ticket. Why? Because he will at least find out that all religions are not created equal. There's a world of a difference in the fine points, in the footnotes, and the distinctives of a worldview, especially the worldview to which you and I are committed in the pursuit and the love of Jesus Christ. The stridency of the willingness to live with this ramification. Listen to Dawkins, for example, speaking to the British Humanist Association during the Voltaire lectures. Here's what he said. He gives an illustration. For example, there was a well-known television chef who did a stunt recently by cooking human placenta. You hear that? A chef who did a stunt by cooking human placenta and serving it up as a pâté, fried with shallots, garlic, lime juice and everything. Everybody said it was delicious. The Father himself had 17 helpings. A scientist can point out, as I have done, says Dawkins, that this is actually an act of cannibalism. Worse, since cloning is such a live issue at the moment, because the placenta is a true genetic clone of the baby. The father was actually eating his own baby's clone. Now listen to how he says this. Science cannot tell you if it's right or wrong to eat your own baby's clone. But it can tell you that's exactly what you are doing. Then you can decide for yourself whether you think it's right or wrong. Do you see what he's done? Very cleverly, he takes away the hand of authority by saying science cannot tell you whether this is right or wrong. But what he does is re-inject the whole thing by giving you the autonomous authority to decide whatever you want to decide. So he builds a relativistic framework that is absolutized by actually telling us there's no such thing as absolutes. Very clever, very clever. And the tragedy of something like this is that there's a cavalier attitude to it, a maverick attitude to it. This is where we are. This is where we are going to move forward. This is what we are going to do. We've come of age. We are not just modern anymore. We're postmodern. We've arrived. We've redefined everything from a designed universe. Everything is random, and the quantum world now becomes the model for us interpreting everything as having no purpose and having no immediate points of definition. That's the first change that took place. And that kind of a change in the West is having huge ramifications. Huge ramifications. Everything is being redefined. And the moment you hold to an absolute, you run the risk of being mocked by an audience. Number two, it's the power of the gathering storm that came about through a disoriented Western culture and an invasive, neutralizing Eastern philosophy. Now, this is not to talk about East as good and West as bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about a worldview where it was suddenly assumed that the mystical and that which maybe was not yielding to the laws of normal scrutiny and logic could easily be absorbed into your living and your lifestyle. My last book was called Why Jesus? I'd actually wanted to call it From Oprah to Chopra, but the publisher wouldn't let it go that way. So they've called it, they gave it a long subtitle. I have a hard time remembering the subtitle. It's called Why Jesus? And it's subtitled this way, Rediscovering His Truth in an Age of Mass-Marketed Spirituality. And I take a look at the great mystics from Swami Vivekananda and Yogananda and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi with the transcendental meditation philosophy and all of that, and show how it came into the West and disoriented ideas of true spirituality. Swami Vivekananda came to the United States in 1893, and in the middle of his talk, he wasn't an invited speaker, he's a brilliant man, but he walked up at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and uninvited he said this, and took the conference by storm. We who come from the East have sat here on the platform day after day and have been told in a patronizing way that we ought to accept Christianity because Christian nations are the most prosperous. We look about us and see England, the most prosperous Christian nation in the world, with her foot on the neck of 250 million Asiatics. We look back into history and see that the prosperity began with the invasion of Mexico. Christianity wins its prosperity by cutting the throats of its fellow human beings. At such a price, the Hindu will not have prosperity. I have sat here today and I have heard the height of intolerance. I've heard the creeds of the Muslims applauded when the Muslim sword is carrying destruction into India. Blood and sword are not for the Hindu, whose religion is based on the laws of love. A round of applause went through the whole auditorium. All of the universities in America were opened up to Swami Vivekananda, and he made an enormous impact with a partial truth covered with an unfortunate untruth. What is the untruth? You never, ever judge a system by its abuse. You never, ever judge a system by its abuse. Do I judge Hinduism by the way they put Graham Staines and his boys into a van and doused it with kerosene and burned them to death? Do I go stand up and say that's what Hinduism is all about? What would he say to that? The fact of the matter is, you evaluate and analyze what it is that ultimately defines us as human beings. You know, in the American Declaration of Independence, there's an absolutely fabulous line. It's a fabulous line. And the founders and framers of those ideas were brilliant in the way they framed it. You look at the documents and you see how marvelously framed it is. We consider these truths to be self-evident. What is self-evident? That all men are created equal. Says who? Not the naturalist, not the pantheist with a caste system. Only in the Judeo-Christian worldview are we created equal. That we are all created equal with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These truths were considered self-evident. They would call it natural law, but it was not just said by the Creator, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. It's a gift of God, not of the state.
Yes.
The gift of God. That we're all created equal and endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I dare you to find any other worldview that would append this line other than the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's a great line. And what we find now, all of a sudden, we who live in the West, and I've lived in the West now for 40 years. I was 20 years old when I left India, and my dad emigrated to Canada, 10 years in Canada, then on to the United States. And I've watched the total self-immolation of the West at the hands of its own intellectuals and at the hands of its own thinkers who've taken away the most sacred truths of life's essential and intrinsic worth, and the entailments were unbelievable. You know, God gave only one prohibition in the garden. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Only one law. Because they broke that, Moses had to give 613. Have you ever gone onto a plane and they tell you no smoking is allowed, and you're not allowed to tamper, disable, or destroy the smoke detector? Why all this qualification stuff? Just say don't mess with it. Don't mess with the smoke detector. But because if you get a lawyer into the room, he could tell you I tampered with it, but I didn't destroy it. All these, you know, one lawyer friend in America was telling me in a court of law, when you ask a person if he was ever alone with this victim, he could actually say, no, I was never alone in the room with that person, because in his mind he can say, if two of us are in the same room, I'm not alone. He said every word has to be so carefully fine-tuned because the human heart is able to pervert and redefine everything. All that came about because we redefined good and evil. That's the way it is. And I bring to you today this challenge to ask yourself, what made the West give it its greatness? May I suggest to you there were entailments from the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave it the knowledge and the wisdom to know when things were wrong. What brought William Wilberforce to fight against slavery? Was it a political theory? Why did he give 50 years of his life for that? Till he was on his deathbed, when the news came that the law had finally been passed, and after 50 years of battling for it, he said, thank God. He wouldn't settle for it partially before, because he saw the image of God and the intrinsic worth of every human being, essentially so, not existentially merely, but essentially. The first change that took place was the death of God and the ramifications with which we are willing to live. Number two, the whole gathering storm of a changing worldview, and the West unable to understand much of its own worldview, how it came about. And number three, the power to inform through the visual. The power to inform through the visual. This is a defining manner in our times. William Blake put these words about the eyes brilliantly. He said this life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole, and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. What Blake is telling us is that we are intended to see through the eye with the conscience, and oftentimes we now see with the eye devoid of a conscience. The circumscription of the visual, where in 5 seconds of a sound bite we think we now understand the news.
That's right.
That's really what we think. We can take a text devoid of a context, make it look like a pretext, and go on with it. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What happens in your living room and my living room at night, or your bedroom and my bedroom at night when you're watching television? You may be an adult now who can see through this stuff, but think of the kids. How you plant a seed like a paper cut to the soul. You know, you just cut into that soul early, and what goes on then as they nurture that without the maturity to be able to handle it, and all that goes on in our entertainment now. The two things that entertain us most are really violence and sensuality. That's what entertains us most. And they are telling us that kids now at the age of 11 and 12 are getting hooked onto pornography and the decimation of the mind to a point that is planting the seeds for the destruction of marriage in the years ahead. It's a fact. You're meant to see through the eye with the conscience. What did Simone Weil say? In reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing so monotonous and boring as evil, but with our imagination it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. Yeah. Nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing so monotonous and boring as evil. But in our imagination it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. And you say, and this thing, night after night, is used by those moguls who know how to bypass the front door of reason and get in through the back door of the imagination. The very point of entrance that Satan used at the garden. Did God really say? No, no, no. You'll become God, you know, when you do this. And you take hold of a person's imagination and you've got him. You've got him. Those three changes, and the fourth, and quickly, the changing of our world into a young world. It's becoming a youth-oriented world, which has both promise and potential disaster. You know, when I was at UCLA, California, last week in Los Angeles, I had lunch, morning coffee actually, with a very prominent professor of law there. I won't name him. He's one of the most known professors on campus. And we had an hour together. He had already met with my colleague John Lennox from Oxford, and John encouraged me to go and see this man, and so we went. And he's not a believer, he's a skeptic. He says, I'm on my journey, but if there's anything that attracts me, he said, it's the person of Jesus Christ. And so he and I were talking. I said, describe your journey to me. He said, well, first of all, politically, he said, I started off young, very conservative. So then I went to university and became liberal, and by the time I graduated, he said I became radically liberal. There was no good and evil anymore left in my mind. And then he became the chief of staff for one of the most radical liberal governors in the country, and then became a professor of law and now heading up a law department there. And he said, and then now he said, here I'm in my veteran years now, Ravi. He said, I'm back to some conservative views of thinking, and but it's too late. He said, our country is gone. I said, define your terms for me. He said, well, I lived as if there were no values except my own. He said, now I've come to the conclusion there are transcending values that we all need to abide by. And if we don't abide by those transcending values, we take the brightest young minds in our universities and we destroy them. We take the brightest young minds in our university and we destroy them. Was it not Viktor Frankl who said that the Holocaust was not ultimately prepared in some military desk, but behind the lecterns of great professors and philosophers. And under. About 20 times the size of Australia is in India, in their 20s and under. The median age of Mexico City is 14 and a half and falling, with a city over 18 million. Astounding time for youth. And I have my colleague Matt, who travels with me. I hope you'll get a chance to meet him. Does a great job just taking care of me on the road and so on. I've often told him that the thing that overwhelms me in all of our gatherings is the high percentage of youth that are coming, Brother Ashley, the high percentage of youth, Even at UCLA, the number of young people, and I was on my feet for 1.5 hours after the forum, answering their questions. They're literally clamoring around you. They're crowding you out, wanting an answer to their question, wanting for you to hear them, wanting to talk about it. Our youth are on the high seas without chart or compass. Wow. And we need to understand. Those are the 4 changes. What is it going to take from the church? And by the way, one of the things you're all doing is just so splendid. You're bridging this, the head to the heart. Archbishop Cogan said this is the longest journey in life. If you don't bridge the head to the heart, you will amputate it and sever the head from feeling, and the feeling will be out of touch with reality, and your thinking will be out of touch with your feeling. You have to connect the two. You have to connect the two, because what I look at my calling ultimately, really, when we look at all that goes on, is how do you reach a generation that that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? That's the challenge. Very good. And I give to you 3 proposals. Number 1, we need an apologetic that is not merely heard, but is also seen. We need an apologetic, a kind of defense of the Christian faith that is not merely coming through our auditory capacities, but is visible to the eye of the person. What Ashley said earlier on, you see and you get the feeling. And this is where we begin to build how you connect the visual with the rational and the intellectual, how the imagination has to be rooted in the real. But the fact of the matter is, if your Christian faith and my Christian faith is not visible to the masses, it doesn't matter how persuasive our arguments are. That's what's needed. That's what's needed. Years ago I was visiting Hawaii and Honolulu. My wife and I were there, and I started to think about the island of Molokai, which I had read about so much. I don't know how many of you have been there. It's one of the most beautiful islands in the world's tallest sea cliffs. But it is known because many, many years ago, all of Hawaii's people with leprosy were sent on to Molokai and ostracized from the rest of the islands. And they weren't having any contact with those people who were well and so on. The moment leprosy was discovered, you were sent on there. I recall when I went, you couldn't go there directly at that time. You had to get permission to come some years ago. You had to get a small plane, which we did take, and arrived out there. And I walked through the bookstore and looked at a book by a woman called Olivia. When you look on the cover of the book, it's a beautiful young gal. As you go through the pages, you see the destruction of leprosy. And in one letter, she writes to Alan Alda, the film actor. She said, one of my great thrills in this life of mine is every night to turn on and watch your program, your sitcom, MASH. She said, I laughed so much. She said, but Ms. Rolda, your program last night broke my heart. You were talking to your buddies and you used your manner with jokes and all. You said, this place is so filthy. What do you think this is? A place for lepers? She said, Mr. Rolda, I am in Molokai. I am not a leper. I am a person with leprosy. And as I walked through there, a man by the name of Joseph Damien from Belgium had given his life to go to Molokai. He gave them the gospel. He built their churches. He touched them. He embraced them. He had chapel every morning. And the only reason he went, by the way, is because his brother was due to go, but his brother very suddenly passed away, and on his deathbed asked Joseph if he would take his place. He honored his brother's calling, but with his own heart went and loved the people. And one day, after years, he was pouring a kettle of boiling water into a cup. The water swirled out and fell onto his bare foot. And it dawned on him for a moment that he didn't feel it. He was terrified. He took a little more hot water from that cup, poured it onto the other foot, and he didn't feel it again. He knew what happened. Nobody knew that morning why he began his sermon so differently. He always began with my fellow believers. But this day he began by saying, my fellow lepers. He was now an outcast himself. So the man showing us around showed us the grave of Damien. I said, I'm amazed, he's buried here? He said, no, actually we did bury him here, but the Belgian government said he's one of their heroes, they wanted him back. And the people here, Molokai, pleaded and begged, and they said, no, he's one of our heroes, we want him back. So finally the people in Molokai made a deal with the Belgian government. We'll send you back the body if you'll cut off his right arm and let his arm remain here in the grave, because that's the hand that reached out and touched us. Amazing. You know, when you can see the Christian faith, it's much more persuasive sometimes than merely speaking it. Number one, an apologetic that is not merely heard but seen. Number two, an apologetic that's not merely argued but is also felt. If you don't operate with conviction, you will never operate with feeling. If you don't operate with conviction, you will never operate with feeling. You see, emotion is a very vital part of your existence and mine. And that's why we worship with such emotion. Yes. Now, I didn't say emotionalism, where the mind is jettisoned, but I'm saying with a legitimate expression of emotion, where truth is kept intact and the emotion is expressed in all the thrills and marvel of what things like music and art and all are intended to do, truly to come both with reason and imagination and bring a beautiful confluence of the two into your life. And so while John Wesley may have been the preacher, Charles was the songwriter, and those two in their theological thinking blended together the marvelous work of God raised in this household by a mother by the name of Susanna Wesley. She named one who caused England to sing. She raised another who caused England to think and understand the nature of the gospel. Beautiful combination. Beautiful combination. And so I bring to you this realization that you must have conviction. That's what generates feeling, not opinion. You know, I'll never forget, I was once in the University of Iowa. I'm due to get back there in a month or so. I was in the University of Iowa, and the place was packed. I think there were about 1,500 in that hall that night. And I was to present a defense on why I believe Jesus Christ to be the only way to God. The place was an overflowing crowd. And at the end of it, a student ran up to the microphone, cupped her hands, and started shouting at me. She said, "Who in the world ever told you that life needed to be coherent?" She said, "Who told you that?" And I was just about floored by the intensity of a question like that. Who told me that life needed to be coherent? She said, "Is this another one of those Western ideas? You're just learned and foisting it upon the rest of us." Now, I've learned, you allow anybody to talk long enough, they'll convict themselves. And so she's going on and on and on. Who told you life needed to be coherent? So I said, "Ma'am, can I just ask you one question that'll help me answer your question?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Here's my question to you. Do you want my answer to be coherent, or may my answer be incoherent?" And the audience roared, and some of them clapped. I said, no. I said, "I want to hear it from you." I said, "Is it okay with you if my answer is incoherent?" She walked away. You see, when we check out other people's lives, we look for incoherence. When we check out our own, we are quite comfortable to live with incoherence. Because we know the truth stings, and we'd rather sting somebody else than sting ourselves. But having said that, I say to you, the vital part of an apologetic is that we ultimately need to have that sense of feeling, not just the sense of argument. And this brings me to the third point. We need an approach that not only rescues the means, but that not only rescues the ends of trying to reach men and women for Christ, but also rescues the means, which is vitally important, that we rebuild confidence and authority in the Word of God. That's what we need. That rebuilds confidence and authority in the Word of God. You know, thy word is truth. The scripture cannot be broken. He, when he comes into the world, will lead you into all truth. It is the Word of God that abides forever. I liked, a little bit of an intro that I was seeing in the green room for Ashley and Jane and their devotions, and the Bible parked in front of the table there. Great way for men and women to begin their day and understand that thy word is truth, line upon line, precept upon precept. If you are with the word and in the word and abiding in the word, you will be his disciple. And then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. 3 universities in America have as their motto, the truth shall set you free. Maybe more, I don't know. I've spoken at all of them. Johns Hopkins is one of them, University of Texas another. I walked through the University of Texas asking students before the open forum, just casually, they didn't know who I was. I said, if you know the truth, the truth shall set you free and you shall be free indeed. They'll say, yeah. I said, where does that come from? Some of them knew it came from the Bible. Most of them said, oh, it's our motto. I said, do you know what precedes that line? Not one student could tell it to me. If you abide in my word, yes, you are my disciples, then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Important grounding on which the liberty actually follows. I'm going to close with a couple of applications and pull this all together for you, because I think it's important we apply it. And it is this. The word is so definitive of life that we reach a generation for which feelings are identical with life, that we must reach them in a way that refocuses their thinking where the word is identical with life. The truth is identical with life. The truth defines life, and from that follows feelings. I remember once on a dialogue, and I think even this marvelous tennis player, Tsonga, somebody put his foot in his mouth this time by saying something about the fact that, we men do better at these emotional games because the women are too emotional, he said. I think he wishes he could take that back. If I were talking to him, what I'd say to him, are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? Or is it this way, that the difference between a man and a woman oftentimes is that they both think, but the woman is more logical in allowing that thinking to influence the feeling, and me men sometimes amputate it and let it not filter down to the actual way in which we feel. And so we are so cerebrally driven, we've amputated the emotions and disconnected ourselves from felt reality. Well, the truth of the matter is that these two need to be connected. Do you think they do a better job at it than we do, and that's why we try to put an extreme poster on that one rather than recognizing this is what we need to be doing too? Yeah. The balance and the connection of the two, the intellect and thinking, has to affect the feeling and the felt reality. So let me close with a couple of illustrations on this that I think are critical. You remember in The Man for All Seasons, Sir Thomas More, actually written by Robert Bolt. Robert Bolt, his brother Sidney Bolt, actually married to one of my dad's cousins. They make their home in Cambridge, England. But Robert Bolt wrote about Sir Thomas More, A Man for All Seasons. And in that, the story is told about Sir Thomas More, how he is asked to compromise his convictions and allow the king to live a compromised life. And so he's put into prison for it. All he's asked to do is just endorse what the king is doing. That's all he has to do. He says, I can't do this. And so he goes in and he's put into prison out there, and what happens as a result? His daughter comes and says, Father, You're in jail. We don't have you at home anymore. Says, Daddy, just say it. It's only words. Just say it. Just tell him it's okay.